Good afternoon and welcome to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. I hope everybody is staying healthy and safe at home. Today we are discussing teleworking during the current public health crisis with Dr. Patricia Mokhtarian. Dr. Mokhtarian is the Susan G. and Christopher D. Pappas Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She joined Georgia Tech in 2013 after 23 years at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Mokhtarian has been studying the adoption and travel-related impacts of information and communication technologies, including teleworking, since 1982, when she was hired by the Southern California Association of Governments to do just that. She has authored or co-authored more than 200 refereed journal articles, technical reports, and other publications, including over 40 peer-reviewed articles relating to teleworking. She is a recent past chair of the International Association for Travel Behavior Research and serves on the editorial boards of 9 transportation journals. Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Mokhtarian, who will discuss what we can learn from previous trends in teleworking and what some of the near-term applications and implications are. We're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. I hope all of our listeners feel free to enter your questions into the question box on the side of your screen at any time, and we'll get to as many of those questions as possible after the presentation. With that, I am going to hand it over to you, Dr. Mokhtarian.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Grossman, and thanks to all of you out there in cyberspace for joining us today. As Alice mentioned in her introduction, I've been studying teleworking nearly 40 years now, and during those past 4 decades, there's been a steady stream of predictions about the impending ubiquity of working from home. We had futurist Alvin Toffler talking about the electronic cottage all the way back in 1980. We had management guru Peter Drucker talking about commuting being obsolete all the way in 1993. We had Francis Cairncross proclaiming the death of distance in 1995 and beyond. And then there have been all those extreme events that have occurred over the years, and I couldn't resist creating this typology of extreme events. Now it's a little bit complicated because there are 4 dimensions to the typology, and we could certainly quibble about the exact categorization of some of these events, but basically I'm distinguishing between whether the event occurs at a building versus on the transportation network, whether it's planned or foreseen in advance versus unplanned, whether the event itself primarily affects structures or humans, and whether its root cause is natural or human. So take a quick look at these types of events, all of which teleworking has been promoted in the context of, and then I'll mention some specific examples on the next slide. We had, as far back as the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, for which I was present in Los Angeles. We had teleworking as a means of reducing the transportation impacts of a major event, and probably every Olympic since then, although I've only listed the ones for which I could easily find documentation of teleworking being discussed. There have been other foreseen or planned events, probably including multiple transit strikes and multiple freeway reconstruction projects. There have been a number of earthquakes. There have been massive infrastructure failures and times of social unrest and terrorist attacks. There have been weather events and, of course, the occasional pandemic. So I want to mention that at the end of this talk, there are 12 hidden slides full of references, including some to media accounts of teleworking during many of these events, other discussions of teleworking in the media, especially including lately, but also some back in time, and then the academic literature that I'll be citing throughout this talk. So if you're interested in the details, and I'll be glossing over lots of details in the interest of time, feel free to ask Eno or myself for the full set of slides. So it seems that history repeats itself with each one of these extreme events. We have lots of people teleworking during the event and the aftermath, and then there's lots of chatter about how now that everyone sees how great teleworking is, it's going to take off rapidly from now on. So with all those extreme events and more that we've seen occurring over the last 4 decades, shouldn't teleworking already have been at high levels even before this pandemic hit us? Well, the numbers you can find are going to be all over the place because it depends on how you define it. So when you stop and think about it, the term working from home includes all of these kinds of things, as well as salaried employees not commuting, which is what we often, stereotypically think of as teleworking. And I want to stress that the transportation impacts of each of those kinds of teleworking differ markedly. And so from a transportation standpoint, I care a lot about how we define working from home and what types of working from home we're talking about. The salaried employees working from home almost certainly reduce travel, although frankly, even that is disputed by some research that I've seen. If you work from home only by checking email from home on evenings and weekends, that really does nothing whatsoever for travel. The impacts of these three kinds of teleworking on travel are ambiguous. It depends on the counterfactual, namely, what would you be doing otherwise? Would you be working at a conventional job with a conventional commute, or would you not be working at all? And finally, if you define teleworking more broadly to include just the use of telecommunications in the context of work, it can include things like field work and working while traveling, which probably help to increase travel. So with all that in mind, when you see statistics like 43% of employees work remotely, or really when you see any statistics relating to working from home or teleworking, it's always a good idea to check what definition is being used. So I believe the most consistent year after year count of teleworkers is going to be given by the Census and the American Community Survey Journey to Work numbers. And in that survey, it's asked every year, how did you usually get to work last week, and worked from home is one of the answers. Now, again, practically every definition of telecommuting you can imagine includes too many people and excludes too many people. So if you just talk about usually working from home, you're including self-employed, which, as we saw in the previous slide, has kind of an ambiguous impact as far as transportation is concerned. But you're also excluding less frequent teleworkers who may work 1 or 2 days a week or even less, but should still be counted and are not being counted by this particular measure. Well, what do the census numbers show? Here's a plot of the usual commute mode shares from 2010 till 2018. I've omitted driving alone, which has remained fairly stable at around 77%, so that we can better see what's happening with the remaining modes. And what we see is that working from home is the green line, and it's had a rather gradual increase over the past 9 years. In fact, it's steadily increased since 1980. So it was at 2.3% in 1980, and now is more than twice that at 5.3% in 2018, and in fact has exceeded the share of transit nationwide as a commute mode to work, except in the most transit-rich cities. So why aren't the numbers higher? I mean, it may be startling that there's more working from home than transit as far as the commute mode goes, but still 5.3%, even granting that it's leaving out those infrequent teleworkers, seems fairly modest. And we've had all those predictions that I started the talk with and all those extreme events. Why aren't the numbers higher than that? Well, you can see a list of reasons here, and I'm going to briefly, and I stress briefly, unpack each of these reasons in the following slides. Again, I'm going to have to gloss over a lot of details, but I've tried to heavily reference everything so that you can follow up on anything you're interested in. So the first obvious question is, how many workers can actually work from home? And there are a couple of different takes on this question. If you look only at job titles or job content, job categories, you get estimates that range from 37% to 56%. Again, a lot of fine print here. But if you actually ask employees directly whether they can work at home or have the option available to them, we see numbers that are quite a bit smaller. And presumably these numbers are taking management willingness into account as well as job suitability. Well, next obvious question is how many people did work from home, at least pre-COVID-19, so before we all had to work at home, quote unquote, how many were working from home? Well, we had the 5.3% that we've already seen from the American Community Survey, and then we have a couple of other takes on this question. Again, some potentially include weekends, exclude self-employed, usually. So all of these numbers could be true depending on the different definitions that they're using. Then it's natural to ask how many are working from home now in the middle of this pandemic. And again, we see different answers on this. There are lots of polls running around out there, as you've probably all seen coming into your own email boxes. I've tried to focus on the ones that are large samples and conducted by highly reputable organizations. So, the 40% was taken fairly early in the shutdown, if you will, whereas the 62% includes people who ever worked at home during the pandemic and not necessarily people who are doing it on a regular basis. So the real answer as to how many are doing it regularly is probably somewhere in between those two numbers. Well, it's a good question to ask how many people really want to work from home, and I say they want to for a reason that you'll see momentarily. Again, if you ask now during COVID-19, the numbers seem fairly high. Lots of people, of those who are already working at home, say they want to do it as much as possible or at least occasionally. I'm a little puzzled by the second bullet here with the IBM poll. If 75% want to work at home at least occasionally, why do less than 40% feel strongly that their employer should provide opt-in remote work options when returning to normal operations? So those two numbers don't quite compute for me. And in general, I would suggest that maybe the stated preference for working from home is fairly soft. The idea is that maybe people say, yes, I want to work from home, but I know either that I can't because of constraints that are not just my job or my manager, but maybe it's workspace at home or my own knowledge of myself that I wouldn't be self-disciplined enough or whatever. So this is admittedly a very old study, but in the study that my colleague and I did ages ago, we found that only 37% of those who could telecommute, both in terms of their job and the manager willingness, and wanted to, so it was both can and want to, only 37% of those actually did. So I think, again, that the desire to telecommute might be somewhat soft many times and potentially overridden by constraints of various kinds. Another pertinent question, especially, again, if we're interested in transportation impacts and, how much is actually going on, not just how many people ever do it, is how often do people telework? And so, again, I think the American Time Use Survey is probably the most reliable numbers on that currently. We looked at it in a lot of the early telecommuting pilot programs and found numbers like 1 or 2 days a week were the typical average frequencies of teleworking. But I wanted to turn to more recent data for obvious reasons. And again, there's some definitional issues here that the definition being used kind of includes too many people and excludes people that should be included. But when the dust clears, we get a number that's pretty similar to what we've seen in the previous older studies, namely that the average frequency is somewhere around 1 to 2 days a week, 1.5 to 2 days a week, and suggesting that about 5% of the non-self-employed workers, because that's all the workforce that these numbers apply to, would be exclusively working from home, which again is fairly restrictive definition because it would exclude going to the coffee shop for an hour or two and working at home the rest of the day. But something like 5% of that group exclusively work at home on any given work day. So that's how often. How about how long? One of the things we noticed in our earlier research is that many teleworkers didn't seem to stay teleworkers for very long. And I must say this is a question that we haven't really fully researched in terms of how many, cycle in and out, maybe back in. How long did they stay in? How long did they stay out? Why did they leave? Why did they come back? But just to give you a few data points here, again, from older studies, we saw a fair amount of attrition and, dropping out of teleworking. Now, what we also saw was that among the reasons for dropping out, the constraints were far more important than the preferences, meaning that people more or less felt like they had to stop teleworking because their job changed or their manager changed to one who was less willing. So it was not, for the most part, that people tried it and decided they didn't like it or that it wasn't working for them. Although, keep in mind that there's self-selection into the telecommuting programs in the first place. So we also saw a fair number of people who may have even signed up for telecommuting, taken training, and then never started telecommuting. So it suggested to us that either they realized in the process of training that it wasn't going to work very well for them, or again, it was a soft commitment to start with. So the preferences kind of got taken care of up front, and once people did start telecommuting, they tended to want to stick with it, but were often unable to do so for very long. Well, you might be wondering, why doesn't everyone want to work from home? At least I've seen lots of blogs and, newspaper articles and so forth suggesting that, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread and this is the revolution we've all been waiting for. So here's all these great reasons, which you can read faster than I can talk. So I don't need to go down the list in detail. These are all reasons you could have come up with on your own. But let's look at the other side of the story, too. I mean, the other question is, why would we want to work from home? And there are a number of disadvantages that have also been coming to light in these last days as well as before. So pros and cons, right? And again, suggest that it's not going to be for everyone. Let's look at the manager's side. Why wouldn't managers want their staff to work from home? And again, lots of good reasons. You could have come up with them on your own. But again, there are lots of reasons why managers might not want their staff to work from home if they don't have to. And of course, nowadays, they may be doing it because they have to. So study after study has shown that management resistance is probably still the strongest barrier to more teleworking taking place. And that's often, frankly, for good reasons. You repeatedly see people referring to the value of in-person communication and the need for in-person teamwork and so forth. And the admission or the realization that remote management does require a certain amount of overhead that is much less there when you have people in the office and easily visible and organizable and so forth. Now, a lot of the resistance to telework is for reasons that may not be as strong. For example, how will I know they're really working? And of course, the standard reply to that is, how do you know they're really working in the office, the conventional office? The truth is that information work are not widgets that you can count, and so presumably you're already judging your workers on the basis of productivity metrics, even if subjective ones. But another concern is, I trust Susie to telework, but Joe, I'm not so sure about, and it's just going to be too complicated to let Susie do it, and then Joe is mad because I won't let him do it. And again, the response would be that, managers probably make discriminatory decisions about their staff's performance, if you will, and I mean discriminatory not in the legally bad sense of the word, but rather they discriminate between workers who are performing excellently and those who are performing very well or up to expectations or not so well, and so forth. So in theory, good management should be able to make those distinctions, and yet many managers just really don't want to deal with the hassle of having to do so. So we've still got some management resistance in place, and frankly, I think that will probably return, at least to some extent, once people can go back to work in the regular workplace. Well, won't it be different this time? I mean, after all, so many things are different, but again, you'll have to excuse me with the 4 decades of having heard that before for being just a wee bit skeptical. But technology is so much better now, I've heard. And yes, it is, and it's going to get even better. But I believe, and many others have said, that technology is not the main barrier to the adoption of teleworking. If you look back, not too many years back, we've had several companies who are entirely based in the technology world and promoting technology for their customers as well as you would think in-house, and yet they've previously cut back or withdrawn their telecommuting programs. And so I would suggest that some of the key reasons that we've already seen for the slow adoption of working from home have not gone away. Things like the value of in-person communication, the weak employee preferences, and then constraints such as home not being a fantastic place to work for many people, internal constraints such as personality, wanting social interaction, discipline, lack of discipline, and so forth. So the boring truth, at least the likely reality, which is so much more boring than either extreme, is that we're not going to go back to the way things were. I fully believe that. But I also, of course, believe that we won't remain at these emergency levels of teleworking indefinitely. So you're probably saying to yourself, yeah, big deal. I could have said that. It's going to be somewhere in between, sure. But lest you think I'm copping out, I'm going to cheerfully go on the record as saying it's probably going to be somewhere toward the left end of the spectrum when we are able to go back to the office after the pandemic is largely past. So it's a probabilistic prediction. I do put some probability weight toward the right half of the scale, but obviously not very much in my view. However, I also want to stress that even if we are pretty far to the left end of the scale, we're still quite a bit farther to the right than we were before, and that's going to be all to the good for all those good reasons that we talked about previously. So I want to wrap up here, and in closing, first of all, we used to ask, how can we increase the adoption of teleworking? Because we all, including myself, fully believe it's a good thing for the environment, for people, for employers, and so forth. How can we get people to do more of it? Well, that's pretty much been taken care of for us in the last few weeks. Now, you could argue that it's been under less than ideal circumstances, so it's not a fair test. But on the other hand, we've had lots of time to adjust to doing it better as time goes on. So I believe that, if nothing else, the pandemic will have given us a very clear idea of the pros and cons of teleworking for both organizations and employers. So let's see what happens, right? And as an academic, of course, I have some research suggestions to make. These are just ones that I'm interested in. There are many, many more, of course, but lots of interesting issues here that I believe we have not done justice to, even despite all these decades of research in the past. And last but not least, I would like to encourage us not to forget the somewhere around 40% of the workforce who cannot telework. I would guess that most of the people listening to this talk right now are working from home or able to work from home, and yet it probably goes without saying, because we've all been reminded very forcefully over the last few weeks of people who don't have that choice. But we are the lucky ones and should be looking out to the extent that we can for those who do not have that choice. So with that, I'll stop and allow Alice to lead us in our question and answer session.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. McTarrian. That was a fabulous presentation. Lots of good information in there about what we've seen and what we can expect, to the point that we can expect anything. We have a lot of questions coming in, so we'll go through as many as possible. And just as a reminder, all of our participants can submit questions at any point in the box on the side of their screen. I'm gonna start off, you mentioned a couple of times that part of the problem with doing research around teleworking is that there are so many different definitions around it. Is this something that we as a research community and a professional community can work to fix, or do you see it as more as a lost cause? And if it is fixable, how do we go about doing so?
Good question. In the second of the two papers I've written entirely on the question of defining telecommuting. I suggested that we probably can't come up with a single uniform definition of teleworking that everyone would adopt, because you can come at it from so many different angles. So from our perspective of transportation impacts, that suggests one type of definition that, again, for example, might exclude working from home on evenings and weekends as overtime. Whereas if you're interested in ICT consumption, bandwidth consumption, maybe you don't care when and where it takes place. You just want to measure all uses of ICT. So, there's just too many different angles on it, I think, to have permanent uniformity. Now, we may be able to come to better congruence with respect to, say, the transportation angle. But I've tried, actually, even after writing these 2 papers and thinking about it a lot, it's really hard to describe the different variations of working from home in a way that will be clear to, say, a survey respondent in a short amount of space, without maybe interviewing and probing and so forth. But if you're trying to do a self-administered survey, it's still a challenge in my book, but one that we should be still working on, and putting the best and brightest minds on it will probably make progress on it.
Excellent. Okay, the next question is going to be a bit of a 2-part combined question. Can you talk a little bit more about the impacts on working from home on the transportation network, both from a modal perspective and a temporal perspective? So what are the sort of mode shifts and impacts on things like transit and new modes like micromobility, the scooters and the bikes and et cetera? And then also, what about the trip making that we see from people working from home, either now or in other times of telecommuting when people aren't as confined to their own homes? And what changes do we see on transportation networks, both during peak hours and then also during off-peak hours?
Right. Good question. And again, I think we need more data and more recent data on that. We tried to look at mode shifts, especially in the early days of telecommuting, but the evidence was mixed, and I would suggest for the best recent evidence, we could probably go back to the mode shares chart that I showed from the American Community Survey earlier, where you saw the progression from 2010 to 2018. And rather than trying to page back to that, I'll just remind you that, if you look at the modes whose shares declined in that period, those are likely the ones from which working from home is taking share. Now, that's not ironclad, which is why we need more data. But, the big loser over the last several years was carpooling or ride sharing. And then to some extent also the active transportation, walking and bicycling, I believe, also declined somewhat. So those would be the ones I would look at first. I mean, micromobility is still just not showing up in the statistics enough for us, for at least me, to really have a handle on whether working from home is really taking from that or just supplementing, vice versa. So I do feel like we could do a lot more with understanding which modes are being, if you will, robbed or diminished by work at home increasing. As far as temporal impacts are concerned, I hate to keep saying it, but it's another area which we have not studied very well. There have been several papers, but a lot more needs to be done on partial day teleworking. So the idea of, how about I just check email at home in the morning and wait till the peak period's over and then go to work in the mid-morning and maybe come back in mid-afternoon and avoid at least one, if not both, peak periods that way. That's absolutely happening, but we really don't have a good handle on how much it's happening. And so, again, we really need more research on that form of teleworking, which could be very popular. Many managers may feel more comfortable with a partial day type teleworking arrangement than they would be with all day. And, it allows you to perhaps have the best of both worlds, reducing impact on the environment and congestion and stress, while also having the advantages of the main workplace.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to shift to a slightly more difficult question. It
Mhm.
might be out of scope. There's a couple questions in here asking about the impacts of teleworking on our real estate markets and land use. And if we see large shifts moving forward, what would that mean for land use mixes and specifically commercial land use and real estate and in the urban fabric?
Right, right. Great question. One of the fine print points, if you will, that I glossed over with no comment as I was giving the talk was, I've seen a lot of talk these days about, why would a company want to keep, paying tens of thousands of dollars a month in rent on office space when now they've realized that all their employees can really work from home. Some of that's bound to happen, but if you really give employees the option of how much they work from home, you saw the statistics that the preferences tend to be toward 1 to 2 days a week, not toward all the time. So at least personally, I'm a little dubious that, the hot desking idea that forget about having an office of your own at the main workplace. You'll just have desks that you drop in on when you do come into the office. There's now sanitation issues and things like that associated with just bouncing around a whole bunch of different desks. But even aside from that, there's a fair amount of evidence that people like having their family's pictures up in the cubicle that's their own, and their mess where they know where to find stuff instead of having to pack stuff up every day and unpack it at the beginning of the next day. I'm not convinced that that many corporations will be able to save, the kinds of big bucks on real estate that is being talked about now. Again, certainly some will, so it's the same story. Yes, some of it will happen, but how much is the question. With respect to homes, I think homes have started to include some working space for quite a while now, and that's going to continue to be the case, even if it's a spare bedroom. Family sizes are still declining, or many families don't have children at all. So, finding space to work from home for, a middle class, upper middle class home is not very difficult these days, and will probably get even more easy to find. I think we can do a lot more with making suburbs more mixed use and having more commercial opportunities mixed in to be at least within a walk or bike of residential neighborhoods. And I'm optimistic that will continue to take root as it already has been doing, but probably way too slowly. And, that's happening and desired almost independently of working from home, but that would certainly contribute to that movement as well.
Great, thank you. So I realize we're already over. I'm just going to go with one more question, and then I promise I'll let everybody get back to working from home. So here's one about the policies. Do you have any recommendations for what policymakers can do to make telecommuting a more viable or attractive option? You mentioned in your presentation that it seems like what we needed was a pandemic to get those things into effect. But beyond that, are there either employer policies or city level or state level or even federal level things that we could be thinking about?
It's a good question because, I feel like telecommuting proponents have sometimes talked out of both sides of their mouth. They've said how great it is, for employee, for employer, for society, and yet we need to give tax incentives or, other kinds of policy instruments to promote more of it. And I'm kind of thinking, well, if it's so great, why isn't that self-evident? And you could argue all the more now that people have had to try it and see for themselves. If it's great, then, why won't they keep doing it even when they don't have to? So it's not, and tax incentives have always seemed to me to be riddled with enforcement issues or monitoring compliance issues and so forth. So, I'm not sure that some of those blunter policy instruments are the answer. On the employer side, obviously, there's a lot that can be done for management from the top down, setting the culture and the expectations to support teleworking. I would encourage it to be on an opt-in basis, at least if a company is trying to change its existing workforce. It's one thing to be hired into a company where from day one that you'll be working from home in state X and the company's headquarters is in state Y, and you'll, come maybe once a month to headquarters, but most of the time you'll be at home. It's one thing to accept that as the condition of employment and even prefer it perhaps from the beginning. It's another thing to kind of be hired as a conventional worker and then be told everybody's going home permanently. I really feel like for all those red reasons I had flashing on the screen as to why it may not be such a great idea for everyone, it really concerns me that some will be kind of, squeezed into doing it involuntarily. So, keeping it voluntary is important, I would think, but again, the point being, if you do that, you may not be saving a lot of money on office space if you've still got employees coming in 3 or 4 days a week. So it's a dilemma, I think, all the way around. But in general, I think managers can certainly be more inclined, can certainly take steps to lay out conditions under which it can and should happen and conditions under which it may need to be withdrawn. I was going to say something else, but I can't think of it right now, so I should probably hush.
That was a nice and complete answer, as it was as well. Well, we have a lot of really good questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to any more. I want to thank Dr. Mokhtarian again for the fabulous presentation and answering so many of the good questions coming in. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and listening to our webinar today. We have another webinar coming up on May 19th on Tuesday on transportation and cybersecurity, looking at the risks of creating a culture of security. So that actually ties into some of the questions we didn't get to today around teleworking and cybersecurity. To that note, you will also be able to find the recording and the slides from today's webinar on our website at enotrans.org, where you can also find other presentations, research reports, and you can sign up for our newsletter, Eno Transportation Weekly, which is our invaluable source for all things transportation and transportation policy. Thank you, everybody. Please stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you again, Dr. Mokhtarian.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.